Hello? Oh, hi. Tell me when I'm on. Hello? I think this works. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Bob Weisberg. I teach criminal law and criminal procedure here at Stanford, and I am one of the faculty directors of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center, which is our research and policy shop on criminal justice and reform issues. And we are the host of the event, but we're partnering it here, of course, with the great Vera Institute, and I'd just like to thank all the people we've worked with at Vera in putting this together. They did most of the heavy lifting, and we're just delighted for this partnership, and we hope to have a long and fruitful one. I also have to apologize when Kevin and I and his colleagues first set this up. We did not anticipate that coming here would cause you to miss the State of the Union address, which is simultaneous. We'd like to replicate the spirit of that event, though, so some of you will be receiving a designation with instructions that at random points you will applaud, while the other half are to sit sullenly. In any event, it'll all be on video in the morning. Okay. I'm going to just make a very few brief introductory remarks about our subject, which is vast and big in literal and metaphoric terms. I was thinking that if you go back to what now seem like the ancient days of police reform, focusing on police in particular, going back to the early 90s in New York City, with all the innovations, some positively viewed, some negatively viewed, in policing that were associated with the great crime drop in New York City and ultimately elsewhere. There was talk about this phenomenon called community policing. There was talk about this related phenomenon called quality of life or broken windows policing. But it's worth remembering that a very important component of those changes was what became known as Comstat policing, which is to say a combination of pretty high, at least in 1990s terms, pretty highly sophisticated computerized analysis of so-called crime hotspots, leading to managerial changes, organizational changes, whereby the police department was directing its officers, particularly at street patrol, of course, to certain areas, and very clearly holding mid-level precinct captains and others accountable for results. And I don't think we used the term big data then, but in a way that was a sort of an example of a precursor of what we have now. The term obviously covers a lot of things now. Here's a way to look at it. We know, for example, that through GPS tracking and other forms of surveillance, whatever you want to call the great monolith of government, they know where we are, they know where we've been all the time. And when as many of you know, the legal system, at least the constitutional law system, is trying to catch up with this, sometimes sensibly, sometimes awkwardly, in recent cases like Jones and Carpenter, and even Riley, I guess we could count, where the phenomenon of high storage data, whether it's in individuals' hands or in government's hands, becomes implicated in constitutional law, particularly the Fourth Amendment. We know that now after Carpenter, there is some Fourth Amendment regulation of GPS tracking, although how far it will extend, we don't know. But of course, it's not just the taking of the information, but the storage of it on vast databases, and then the question of how that is used later, whether to go after certain targets or look at things more generally. Here again, the legal system, or even more obviously, doesn't even know how it will try to catch up. Is there a search of your person long after the data was captured, when the computer systems look at your data in the database? We just don't know yet. Now, that's an example of big data that the government creates for its own benefit and not necessarily for yours. It creates an information asymmetry, to use a pompous term, where you probably don't know what the information is that they've stored about you. You don't even know it exists. Another way to look at it is even a little scarier in a kind of existential sense, that not only does the government through big data know things about you that you don't know they know. This is going to be a really convoluted sentence. I'll try to get out of it grammatically. They know things about you that you don't know. That you wouldn't know, because they, of course, can construct they can construct a vast, complex biography of your life, which may be very different from your own self-conception. So the kind of existential effects of this may be significant, and of course, we want to know how this will be regulated. At the same time, we know that big data is, going back to Comstat policing, sometimes in a good sense, sometimes maybe not in a good sense, is a tool of management of law enforcement agencies to hold itself accountable, often to itself, and to manage its own resources and its officers. As an extension of that, outsiders, including academic researchers, will often applaud government when it does this sort of thing on the theory that it will make government better. It will, for example, use sensible, rational risk assessments and algorithms and so on to improve the fairness and accuracy of what it does in criminal justice. But of course, that assumes that we can know what they're doing, even when they're supposedly doing constructively. Another form of big data, if you will, is the form of big data that doesn't exist now or doesn't exist because government has created it, but where outsiders want government to create it because it'll be a way of holding government accountable. Or it may be the form of big data where outsiders, again, especially academic researchers like many here, are happy to create the big data in the sense of some big systematic format as long as they can get the raw data. So the kind of political science of where big data fits into the relationship between government and its citizens is obviously extremely complex. So tonight we have, thanks to the Vera people, a great panel of experts from a number of different perspectives on this issue, and we hope to drill down into it pretty thoroughly. So I'm going to turn things over to Vera's great Jim Parsons, who is going to introduce our panelists and will moderate the panel. But just wanted to say you're all very welcome to be here. Jim?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out to spend a part of this evening with us and for engaging in this, what I'm sure will be an interesting conversation. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to Dr. Weisberg for hosting us here today. We're really excited to have this conversation about technology, data, and justice reform here at Stanford in Silicon Valley, and that's only possible because of our partnership with Stanford, and we're incredibly grateful. Thank you.
And by the way, I want to also mention my colleague, Debbie Mukamala, Executive Director, who is responsible for all the good things that happen.
Yeah. We're also excited to be here because Vera has done work in California for many years, but this week we are opening a new office in LA. Stacey Strongaroni here is the director of our LA office, and so being here, having several Vera staff here during this important week for us is also fantastic. And finally, happy Lunar New Year to everybody. And I'm very glad personally that I'm missing the State of the Union because I don't have to go through that. So, the Vera Institute of Justice works on a wide array of issues that focus on many different steps in the justice system, and the use of data to understand problems and develop solutions is at the heart of almost everything that we do. And if I had to name the top 3 problems with the justice system today, I would say 1, that it's far too big; 2, that it's racially biased at every step of the system; and 3, that it's almost entirely lacking in transparency and there's no accountability for people working in the system. So this conversation today about data and justice kind of addresses, obviously, the transparency issue, but it addresses all 3 of those problems that we see with the justice system. The problem with transparency is so bad that in most places we have no real idea of what justice system actors are doing. Police, we don't know what the police do in any kind of fine-grained way, the courts or the correction system. For example, Vera, as part of our work, we use data on jails to track trends in incarceration over a long time period. So we can see how rates of incarceration have changed in different parts of the country. The federal government collects data on who's in jail. The most recent data available from the federal government was produced in 2013. So in terms of policymakers making decisions about mass incarceration, we're basing those decisions on information that's 6 years out of date, and I don't know many sectors that would see that as being an acceptable way of running a railroad, operating a justice system. And in other parts of the justice system are almost entirely opaque. As many of you know, prosecutors have a huge amount of discretion in determining outcomes of cases. Most prosecutors' offices, there's no sense of how they make decisions and how those decisions affect different groups of people. Although we know prosecutors in many places drive racial bias within the justice system, we just don't have the data. So the list of things that we don't know is rather long. And on the other hand, so we need more data, we need more transparency. There are resources within the private sector and within the tech industry for analyzing large quantitative data sets and thinking about how we use data. So there's potential opportunities to tap into some of these resources that exist so we can drive justice system reform, but there are also many risks associated. And here in California, we've seen how that's played out with the bail reform and how the use of algorithms to predict risk in pre-trial decision-making has been incredibly hotly contested and problematic. And in the justice system, of course, the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about people's lives. So the question that we're grappling with tonight is, how do we use data? How do we increase transparency and accountability? Where are the resources we can tap into? And what are the risks? So how can we hold public servants accountable without exacerbating the problems that already exist? And we have a fantastic group of panelists to wrestle with those questions with us. And so I'm going to just give quick introductions to the panelists, and then I'll jump into some of the questions. So to my left, Dr. Christiane Lum is the lead statistician at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, where she leads the project on criminal justice in the United States. Christiane's research primarily focuses on examining the use of machine learning in the criminal justice system and has concretely demonstrated the potential for machine learning-based predictive policing models to reinforce and, in some cases, amplify historical racial biases in law enforcement. She has also applied a diverse set of methodologies to better understand the criminal justice system, causal inference methods to explore the impact of setting bail on the likelihood of pleading or being found guilty, and agent-based modeling methods derived from epidemiology to study the disease-like spread of incarceration through a social influence network. To her left, Justin Steele is a principal at Google.org, where he leads Google's philanthropy in the US, Canada, and Latin America. Prior to joining Google.org, Justin served as deputy director of the Washington, D.C. site of job training nonprofit Year Up, and he began his career as a management consultant at Bain & Co. and the Bridgespan Group. Justin received an undergraduate degree in engineering from the University of Virginia and earned a dual MBA, MPA degree from Harvard with a concentration in nonprofit management and urban social policy. And to his left, Dr. Sharad Goyal Sharad's primary area of research is computational social science, an emerging discipline at the intersection of computer science, statistics, and the social sciences. He's assistant professor of management and science and engineering at Stanford, and he's particularly interested in applying modern computational and statistical techniques to study social and political policies such as stop and frisk, swing voting, filter bubbles, do not track, and media bias. Before joining Stanford, Sharad was a senior researcher at Microsoft Research and Yahoo Labs. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. The way I'd like to do this is I have some questions to fire at our panelists. I'm hoping that this will be a discussion, a conversation. So if I ask a question to one of the panelists, not you, and you want to jump in, then please do. And then also I want to have a chance for a Q&A with the audience, so we'll leave plenty of time at the end to ask questions. So to get started, a kind of elementary question, I guess, but complicated. Firstly, can we use data to increase transparency in the justice system? And what are some of the most effective uses of large quantitative data sets that you have seen in the justice system? And Christiane, I'm going to start with you, to my left.
So, I think the answer is a little bit of yes and no. So I'll start with the yes and then go on to the no. So I think data can help us with transparency in the criminal justice system, particularly by sort of illuminating the institutional processes at play. So, for example, more data could help us understand things about how the institution's working, right? How much time between the beginning of a case till the end of the case. Are there, say, racial disparities in the rate at which people are accepting plea deals? Are there, what's the rate at which bail is being set, broken down by things like race or gender or all these things, so we can understand better just how the system is working. I think data really can play a big role in increasing how well we understand how the institution is working. Now, the no side of this is I think there's no amount of data that can really help us understand sort of this like visceral inhumanity of being incarcerated, right? I don't know if people are following the situation in New York. I think there's a facility in Brooklyn where they haven't had heat despite the Arctic freeze and temperatures that have been at play right now. I don't think any amount of data can really help you understand what it's like to be incarcerated. Many of those people are pretrial, so they've not been found guilty of anything, and be basically freezing, waiting for your court date. There's this great report put out by Human Rights Watch where they talked about a person who pled guilty because he was the sole care provider for his child and he needed to be released, right? So he was going to get out on time served. I don't think there's any amount of data that can really help us understand what that would feel like. And I was on a panel, I guess about a year ago, with a man who was also in pretrial detention and on his first day there saw a person cut, he said, from his eye down to his neck. Again, I don't think there's any amount of data that can help you understand the fear you would feel in that situation and how that would change your decision-making process around, accepting plea deals or not. And so, yes, I think data can help us really understand how the institution is working, but I don't think it can help us understand the experience that people who are within the system are having.
Is it almost dangerous, though, that it gives a kind of a quantitative gloss, like it gives the impression that you can understand the system without actually allowing you to really understand how it operates?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think data, when we derive figures from data, or we derive these sort of facts from data, it does come across as sort of this complete story, right?
Yeah,
it comes across as in some way very authoritative, and I think there is this other side that the sort of humanity of the situation that we miss out on when things are boiled down strictly to numbers. Of course, we do need the numbers, right, to understand how widespread things are, to sort of separate out anecdotal things from sort of widespread patterns. But I think both are important when we're talking about the criminal justice system. I think we really need both sides of that coin to understand how things are working.
Yeah. Sharad, can I put you on the spot and see if you have any thoughts about things that you've seen that perhaps data has worked?
So I like Christian's comments that it's both yes and no, that it's easy to say, oh yeah, transparency is great. I think in practice, it's pretty complicated. And so, for example, a couple years ago, we released a big data set of traffic stops, about 100 million traffic stop records across the United States. This is one of the big data sets compiled in this area ever. And what happened? Pretty much nothing happened. And so, we spent all this effort doing it. And the point is that, yeah, in a sense, we're bringing all this transparency to the sector that had not seen it before, but nobody's going to do anything with it. And so you have to actually go beyond just releasing the data sets, that you actually have to do the analysis. And when you do the analysis, it's always non-trivial. And so a lot of what we were trying to do is develop tools to understand how to make sense of the data, and then even going beyond that, how to actually make decisions. And so transparency is like one of these things that's just like easy to throw out and be like, yeah, let's have transparency. Like, who's going to be against transparency? The problem is that I think by itself, it doesn't really get us that much. It's just like this thing that should be happening. The more I learn about the criminal justice system, the more I'm like, wow, this is crazy. It's just like this Byzantine system, that's just like Kafka-esque, what is going on? It's like, yeah, we don't have any transparency, that's true, but releasing data in and of itself is not going to actually help us solve problems. And I think the flip side is that in some cases, transparency is sort of predicated on goodwill or finding something that you can change. But I think often it's like you look at like these like body cam footage. It can create distrust in the system, which I think in the short term potentially is harmful. In the long term, the hope is that transparency will encourage people to do better. But there are risks. I mean, you don't necessarily want to know how the sausage is made. And this is a real problem. And there is this, like, just releasing data willy-nilly, I think is it's a more complicated issue than that. Again, just finishing up on one of our examples, with this open policing, we had we got all these public records requests from all these different states across the country, and a lot of these had what I thought was pretty sensitive information, like people's drivers' names or driver's license numbers. And part of us were like, this is all public record. We should be completely transparent and just release all the information out there. And we would be this would be legal, it would pass our IRB, this is fine. But we made the decision that we're not actually going to be that transparent there, that we felt that we had to put some barrier between what is technically out there and is public and what we actually think is useful for people to see. And so this was a difficult choice, because before that I'd always been, we're going to release all our code, we're going to release all our data, and this is one of the first chances where I had to make the decision of holding something back because I thought that transparency would potentially be problematic in that case.
Right. Yeah. So Justin, you work for Google.org. Mm-hmm. The philanthropic arm of Google. There's this issue of, and also just to add to what you were saying, Gerard, the challenge is also there are more than 3,000 counties and 18,000 police departments. So this is incredibly atomized. If you come up with a solution, it has to deal with this incredible kind of diversity of data. So Justin, you work for the philanthropic arm of Google. How do you think that justice reform organizations can leverage the resources that exist within organizations like yours? And what are some of the risks?
Yeah, so obviously Google's mission is very aligned around data. The mission is to organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. So obviously I'd be somewhat hypocritical to get up here and say that data isn't useful. I can't think of a system where the data is less accessible and useful than the criminal justice system. So it's definitely been a big mission of ours to sort of extend that work into the criminal justice system. And thanks to some of my colleagues who are sitting in the audience today, we've invested over $30 million in the criminal justice system. And we started out sort of with a broad swath of criminal justice reform investments, but over time have really focused in on this use of sort of data science to try to drive reform. And we've invested in policing, sentencing, and through Vera project, through jails transparency. And I think it's still early days. I think my fellow panelists make a really good point about having accessibility. The part of Google's mission about making data accessible doesn't mean anything's necessarily going to change. And we see over and over and over again that humans have incredible confirmation bias, right? We'll believe anything if we believe it strongly enough. I was watching the R. Kelly documentary a couple of weeks ago, and if you want to see a case of just extreme confirmation bias of people who just over and over in the face of overwhelming data and overwhelming evidence just refuse to believe, even people that he's eventually victimized, you just refuse to believe until they were the victim that he was perpetrating these crimes. And so we know that data isn't everything. It's not going to be a magic silver bullet that sort of gets over some of that confirmation bias hump. But if we can make it useful to people, if we can put it in the hands of organizers and policymakers, I do think that there's some powerful leverage there. And I think the work that we've done with the Center for Policing Equity on policing, Measures for Justice in the court system, Vera Institute with jails data has showed some really early promise. And in particular going beyond just the money. So obviously organizations need money to do this work, but I'm really proud of the work that my colleagues Jen and Aaron and Mab have done to bring Google engineers and data scientists into Vera. We've got a project that I can't speak too much about because we're still sort of working on it and we're not ready to sort of fully bring it out into the world, but having our engineers spend months, boomeranging out of Google and spending time at Vera working on some of that. And we've already completed a project with the Center for Policing Equity where our engineers spent 6 weeks. And, and a lot of it is very basic stuff. It's you've got to learn how to scrape data from 18,000 police departments or 3,000 counties at the court systems or the jails. You got to figure out how to clean that data and make sure that it's properly coded, classified, so it's comparable across data sets. You got to figure out how to actually put that information out into the world in a way that's accessible to people. It seems basic, but it's quite difficult when you start looking at how many. It's 18,000 little fiefdoms with data locked in the dungeon, and how do you get that out of all of those little spaces and make it intelligible to people is actually quite challenging. And
I think some people in this room have spent time in the administrative data that comes from courts and police departments, and when you start to look at that, you think it's going to be straightforward, but it's a mess.
Well, one thing we found in the Center for Policing Equity was it's taking them 6 months to turn around a report to these police departments. So a police chief would invite Dr. Goff and the Center for Policing Equity in, say we actually want to hand you all of our data on police stops, police use of force. It's going to be racially tagged. You're going to be able to disaggregate that data and tell us where racial disparities are opening up in our practices of policing. And it would take 6 months to ingest the data, clean it all up. I mean, obviously officers are sort of making notes on the fly, like how do you correct inconsistencies, how do you properly classify things, and turn that back around. And our engineers have been able to take that down just a matter of days now by being able to use technology to clean that data up and ingest it in faster ways. So I think that's one step towards this being sort of useful and towards reform. But as my co-panelists have sort of rightly pointed out, that's only a very short step towards a much longer journey to get this system to change.
What should we be, as we think about this connection between the resources and the expertise within the tech sector and justice reform, are there things that we should be cautious about? Are there things that are risky? Or, I mean, this is to any of the panelists. I mean, so this is, I think, a fairly new terrain for many organizations. There's different cultures, different practices, different ways of working within these two different sectors, and I'm just wondering if that's something that we need to be careful about.
So one of the things you were talking about that I think sort of resonates with me as someone who works with criminal justice data a lot is, taking this sort of engineering approach and wanting to make things scalable. In a lot of cases, at least in my experience, doesn't work very well when we're talking about criminal justice data, and I'm sure your team knows this very well. You end up with these sort of, like you said, fiefdoms of data or sort of like local just rules that are done, or it's not especially well documented, so I'm not explaining this well. I'll give some examples. One example is that I was looking at some data on the amount of bail that was set, and I was trying to just do some simple tabulations, say broken down by charge type or something, how much bail is set. And there was just sort of a local convention in this data set that the bail would be recorded as $1 if the person had an open case in another jurisdiction on a separate line. And so you find all these examples of individuals who had $1 bail set, but that wasn't actually what was going on. That was an administrative bookkeeping tactic, and that wasn't actually documented anywhere. That I only figured that out because I was like, this doesn't make any sense at all. Why would you put this, right? And so if I just used the data as is, I could have come up with some really bonkers things where people who have like a lot of open cases, right, end up on average having very low bail set. Because you average in all those $1, you're going to end up with a really low number. And so without sort of really digging into the data and finding that sort of local convention, you could come to some really erroneous conclusions. Another example, and this is just about sort of the messiness of criminal justice data, is I was trying to figure out just at what rate do people appear for court if bail is set or if they're released on sort of non-monetary conditions of release. You'd think that would be really easy, right? You have data from the court system, you have did they show up, did they not show up, without going into the details of why this was. That actually wasn't sufficient to figure out just how often do people miss their court dates disaggregated by whether they paid to get out or did not pay. In order to do that, we had to get data from the sheriff, and this is all in PDFs, so it required a whole lot of manual data entry. We tried to OCR, it didn't work. And so there's both the problem that there's not really like a consistent record-keeping format across different jurisdictions, but there's also the problem that the data you might need to do some sort of very, very simple, just basic analysis will be stored in different places that don't really talk to each other, and sometimes on PDFs, which is just, that's tough when you want to do data analysis. Yeah.
And if you put some of this data into, and if you tend to take that data and put it through like some kind of machine learning kind of process, then that idiosyncrasy that you might not have noticed with the $1 bail, for example, you can come up with some really strange results, and you wouldn't be able to, by that point, the separation between the results and the data, that has been torn apart. So
that's totally right. Yeah.
That seems like
right now that's encoded in the model, and the model's sort of forgotten that was derived from this sort of local rule that was just bookkeeping rule, and now you have some sort of crazy model that doesn't make a lot of sense.
So I think that's exactly right. And it's a kind of a funny thing to say. I'm in the School of Engineering. I teach engineers. I consider myself an engineer. But I think we're not teaching our students the types of skills that they need to understand these substantive domains. I mean, it's great to work with engineers. I mean, many of my own students are engineers, but it's this like idea of like, let's do everything at scale. You know, you hear this word all the time, scale. And I think the reality is that we have to go into every jurisdiction, and it's a lot of work. And so when we were working with Nashville, for example, we were asked to come in and investigate their policing practices. It took us a year to do that. And the data we could process in a couple days. I mean, it's relatively trivial for us to analyze the data in some superficial sense and clean up the data. The problem is we have to understand what's actually going on. And that means going there, and we took several trips to fly out there, to meet with the command staff and meet with the people in the community, and to actually understand what's going on and to see what might be driving the phenomenon that we're seeing. And that's just a very different process than what an engineer is taught. And it's much more removed. I mean, this goes back to Christiane's point of the data being kind of too sterile and not really telling us the whole story. I actually think of I think of ethnographic data as a form of data. And so in that sense, it's all part of it. Like hearing stories is a way of collecting data, but certainly the stereotypical approach is you just have some either messy or some structured data, and that's very much not the type of information that you want when you're really trying to make a substantive contribution. So I think that we're trying to change this. We're trying to change this here at Stanford. We're trying to change this. I think other people are trying to change this at other schools. But it has to go much more than the type of skills that are used to optimizing an ad engine, which I'm using this example, but that's I think what the types of skills that we're actually teaching our students. That's very different than the types of skills that you need to analyze the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
So you need the people with the technical skills, but you also need people who are very close to the data and very close to the systems.
Yeah, and it's just funny. I've always struggled with even identifying what is this skill. It's like not even clear to me what it is. But you see this in I think the social science departments, the humanities departments are much more adept at teaching this, or maybe the students who are in these departments are self-selecting into those. But there is there's something that's often missing in the engineering side of campus that is going beyond just writing the lines of code. And it's just a way of thinking about the problem, which is essential to these issues.
Like a deep understanding of complex human systems. That's my friend Donald here at Google is also trying to understand. But like, how do human systems actually interact in very complex ways that doesn't yield very quickly to an algorithm, right? And engineers don't always understand that side of it. But when they get it right, it can be so powerful. I mean, the Center for Police Inequity in Las Vegas did an analysis of their use of force data. They found that there were huge racial disparities during foot chases. So it's when the officers would be on a foot pursuit, adrenaline pumping, stop the perpetrator. Oftentimes the perpetrator at that point is caught and not an immediate threat to the people around them. But if you allow the engaging officer to actually physically confront the suspect, then there were these huge disparities of use of force by race. And so the police department was able to see that through CPE's help and institute a new policy that if the suspect wasn't an immediate threat to the people around them, that the engaging officer was actually not supposed to physically engage the suspect, but rather wait for another officer to come on site. And they were able to reduce use of force disparities by 40% just with that one policy. So it can be quite powerful if you do it thoughtfully and and look at the nuance and get it right. And they've got PhDs in criminology, making sure that things are being classified correctly, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I hate the word data because it like suggests this very sort of sterile process of, you just give us the data and now we're going to give you an answer. And it's like, no, that's not really how it works. But certainly the tools and the approaches that we have now are very powerful when they're deployed.
It's interesting. So Vera, one of the approaches we're using more and more is collaborative research. And so the people who are actually impacted by the systems are the ones who are helping design the questions and analyze the data. Because if you're incarcerated or have been incarcerated, you're going to understand what jail data means more than a criminologist or a computer scientist or an engineer, right? So I think that they're privileging lived experience and respecting that, I think, is important as well. And how you build that in when you've got that as an important as essential. But then also these huge data sets in many different places, I think, is a challenge that we're still kind of grappling with. It's fine if you could say no. Are there sectors you think they've got this right, or that as people, justice reformers, we can look and say this worked well in this setting or this other place that we can look to for examples?
I mean, I think there are lots of, I mean, everyone is doing some version of this. I don't know if there's a gold standard out there yet. I mean, the sector I'm most familiar with is tech. I spent many years working in tech, and I think that's kind of, there are plenty of examples of the good, bad, and ugly coming out of tech and data. So that certainly that was one of the first examples where it was just incredibly powerful of the idea that you can log interactions online. That seems like obvious now. It wasn't obvious at some point not so long ago, and I don't think people realize what you could do by logging that information and now having these models, you know, that effectively been designed to sell people things, and that you know that's sort of the dark side of it, is that it's maybe pushing us towards things that might not be in our interest. The bright side of it is it's like discovered this whole new model of funding the internet, and so there are all of these things that you can do with data, obviously. And now we're having this conversation, particularly in tech, but also in other places, about what does it mean to be fair when you're training machine learning models, whenever you're doing this. And it's an interesting question that it's become very popular in the last few years. It's surprising to me that we had basically 20 years where we should have been asking that question and we didn't. It's like nothing has really fundamentally changed over those couple decades, but now all of a sudden we realize that this is an important thing to ask. So in that sense, I think we are making progress, but I wouldn't point to any one sector as saying this is where we should be.
So I think we would all agree that, I think in our comments we all said that the justice system is severely flawed at many different points. And so the problem is, of course, that if you're taking data from the justice system, if you want to understand how to improve policing by using data on policing, your data inputs are not good, right? One, the data is messy. Two, the data reflects a system that is incredibly biased and reflects all these informal processes which guide police to operate in certain ways. So how do we avoid, and if you're not careful, if you're modeling or building tech kind of solutions, you're just going to bake that in. It's just going to be part of the environment that you're doing the work in. What steps can we take to avoid doing that so that we're not, in risk assessment is a good example, we're not using bad data to make bad decisions and potentially making the system worse? I'm going to point that to you.
Yeah, sure. So I had, I think, three ideas for this one. I think you basically said idea number 2, but I'll probably reiterate it again when I get to it. But I think idea number 1 is that we have to be very clear that data itself is not necessarily objective. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And especially when we're talking about data on criminality, and I wanted to pull up my phone because I saw this great quote from Clint Smith on Twitter about criminality, right, where he says, it's not a static state of being, it's a decision made by people in positions of authority to wield punitive power against certain people while ignoring the transgressions of others. So when we have data on criminality, it might be an accurate reflection of, say, who was arrested or prison sentences or anything like that. It might be an accurate recording or an accurate recollection of what happened, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's objective. It still is the product of subjective decisions made along the way. So we have to get away from the idea that just because something is, say, encoded in a database, or maybe even more simply in a spreadsheet, that makes it some objective reflection of reality. In many cases, it'll still be subject to very biased human decision-making. The second point I think that I would like to get away from in this case would be to then get away from the idea that when we apply some sort of technology to that data, that those problems go away, right? And this isn't particularly in the context of machine learning or in predictive modeling, which we might talk about a little bit later. But when we apply a predictive model, or when we train a machine learning model with data from the past, that model is going to learn the historical biases of the past. So if in the past, say, black people were arrested at a higher rate than white people for the same level of criminality, your model is going to learn that same pattern, and it doesn't have the context to know that there was that disparity. It's just going to learn, in the simplest terms, that black people are more criminal than white people, right? That it doesn't have the context to separate out those processes. And so second point is we can't be fooled by the idea that technology is going to get us away from these sort of historical problems. And the third thing that I think I see as being something we need to look out for is letting technology sort of change the problem we're addressing or change the question that we're asking. So in predictive policing, for example, it'll often be sold or marketed as race neutral, and I think implicit in that is that it's addressing a problem of, say, racist policing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That at least to me that's what that's saying when they're saying it's a race neutral system. It's speaking to this problem that I think many of us acknowledge, that policing itself has problems, in particular with sort of racial bias. Now the software typically operates by making predictions about where crimes are going to occur. The problem with racist policing isn't that police don't know where crimes are going to occur. It's sort of changing the question we're trying to address, right? The reason there's racist policing isn't that police don't know where to go. So when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So when you have some technology, all these machine learning models, they're good at making predictions. But the problem in this case is not going to be solved by making better predictions. The problem is going to be solved by getting more to the root of the problem. Implicit bias training. I don't even know what all the solutions are, but we need to sort of take a step back and make sure that we're not letting the technology dictate what the questions we're asking are and what the solutions will be.
I mean, the challenge is, right, when the system is so broken, so with the court system, which sends like millions of people every year to jail, there's so much low-hanging fruit,
right,
that there's so many improvements in most places you can make that there's some things that. So are you looking for incremental changes in technology, or are you saying we should be thinking differently about the system and using technology to create a different system rather than trying to marginally improve a broken system using something like risk assessment? The pretrial system still incarcerates more people of color and more people with fewer resources. Is there a technology fix to that which is not just a marginal improvement, or saying, well, yes, it's racially biased, but it's better than the entirely biased and arbitrary system we had before? I think that's a dangerous path, right? We don't want to just replace something which is flawed with a technologically flawed version because we think it's better for some reason.
Right, I totally agree. What I hear a lot in the risk assessment debate is that, well, it's better than the status quo.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that the standard we should be holding new kind of solutions to then?
Yeah, that's what I wonder. I mean, I'm sympathetic to both sides of this. Like, I think, there's sort of this harm reduction tendency we have. It's like, well, maybe we can get more people out right now. Maybe if we implement the system today, we can make some steps towards, say, racial parity in whatever metric we're interested in, or we can, convince judges that people are really lower risk, that really the risk of flight or the risk of committing some sort of serious crime while released pretrial is actually as low as it is, and using a tool like this will help judges understand that and release more people. I think the risk is that, one, now we've entrenched these biases because the data is obviously generated by historical processes, which, as we just discussed, are sort of encoding bias. But two, what are we leaving on the table? Are there larger policy changes that could get us farther than this sort of incremental change, right? This incremental change might get us something right now, but if I don't even know, if we hold off a little bit longer, could we get the policy changes that we really need? And on the other side of that, right, this is sort of, the internal debate I have all the time, so forgive me for just sort of rambling on because it's literally what keeps me up at night. I also understand that some people think that implementing risk assessment is sort of a way to get us some of the policy changes that we do want. So in the New Jersey case, right, they made a bunch of changes, but part of the package of changes that were made was a risk assessment. And I think many people feel that the risk assessment is sort of just this promise, like, look, we are going to be releasing more people, but they're going to be the right people. They're not going to be the dangerous bad people, which is I think, flawed because of the way it's being administered. But by adding on that sort of scientific promise, maybe pseudoscientific promise, layered on top of the policy changes they want to get through, they wouldn't have been able to get those other changes through without that promise on top of it. And so, I honestly, like I said, these are the things that keep me up at night. This is a very complicated question. And, I think a lot of people who are involved in this debate want to move towards sort of decarceral ends, and I think there's just a lot of disagreement about how to get there, and sort of, are we going to get stuck in a local mode of, these systems being in place?
Yeah.
Well said.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like we need to think of the end point and then how we get there, rather than kind of trying to work towards something using a variety of tools and then just because you don't know what the end point's going to be then, right?
Yeah.
I think I agree with all of that. I think in practice, a lot of people tend to overestimate the value of waiting. And I don't think that not doing anything for 10 years is going to, all of a sudden, we're going to be like, okay, now is the time, and let's just fix it. And so I'm maybe much more open to incremental change. I mean, I do believe it's incremental, and I think that when someone is proposing a risk assessment tool, or using a risk assessment tool that is incremental, it's like, why do we even have money bail in the first place? And so this is just like one small step. At the same time, I'm pessimistic that we're going to see wholesale change in a lot of places. So I think this is difficult. What I think is, but I do think it's problematic when people are underestimating the immediate impact that some of these technologies can have, and overestimating, again, the value of waiting and just saying, like, let's hold the line, and we're not going to do anything until we get everything we want. It's hard. I mean, strategically, I don't actually know what's best, but I do feel like this is how the debate has often played out. That just because the imperfect sort of dominates what is actually feasible here.
Justin, so how does, on the business side, how does Google think about bias in the way that some of your products operate, and are there things that Google and other organizations do to address that might be useful to some of the discussions we're having now?
I mean, I think Google has learned the hard way to exercise caution. I think some of the challenges, particularly with like AI and machine learning, is that you don't always know what's going on inside that black AI box, right? I mean, it's the computer making very complex, connections between big data sets and the output. And I'm, pretty famously, Google Photos tagging technology was tagging some black people as gorillas in photos, and it was awful. And they got called out on social media for it, and and Google subsequently has basically just taken offline the ability to tag like gorillas and chimpanzees in photos while the technology sort of catches up. But it's an AI algorithm that's trying to figure those things out, and it's not as simple as just opening that box and changing a line of code to correct it, right? And so we're in the early days of AI, and I think sort of exercising some caution and saying, let's just take that functionality offline for a while before we can figure out sort of how we can be 100% sure that this isn't misclassifying things. And you think in the criminal justice system all the more. I mean, people's life and liberty is at stake, and so the exercise of caution is probably quite wise.
Yeah, and in the criminal justice system, one of the problems I think with risk assessment is that the balance between what is a acceptable level of precision is incredibly off. So if a risk assessment tool gets it right 20% of the time, that's a good risk assessment tool, and that's the standard which is being held to. In any other place, that's would be entirely, implausible. High risk, you may fail to appear or recidivate or commit a crime 20% of the time, but that is enough justification to hold you in jail. So, I mean, that seems kind of crazy to me. So.
Well, this is actually, I think, more complicated than that, because it's not necessarily the case that one can improve precision in the criminal justice system. It's like, you think about baseball, and we're trying to predict who's gonna win. Right. That's a very different type of prediction. You're really not going to get that good a prediction at the end of the day. And so here, I think it is a context where we're talking about compared to what. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we can spend 10 more years and we'll throw some deep learning at it or whatever, and all of a sudden we're going to go from 20% to 70%. Yeah. That's just not going to happen. Right. And it's like maybe the 20% is bad in some absolute sense, but maybe it's a lot better than the 10% that the human was getting. Yeah. And so I do think that these absolute comparisons can be misleading.
Yeah. I think the danger is it diverts attention from the real question, which is why making decisions to hold people who are not found guilty in jail for trial. Yeah. And having a risk assessment tool or another kind of patch for that takes the attention away from these bigger discussions about, well, this part of the system is fundamentally flawed, and let's address that question rather than think about using technology to try and come up with a patch.
Well, it's tricky. I mean, I hear that claim. It's not clear to me it's true. I mean, I think it's definitely something. This goes to, I think, what Christiane was talking about. Is it actually true that making risk empirical will push us to a worse place? Like, will it actually make us not have the important conversation? And I don't know. I mean, rationally, these are independent things. You can be like, we can do better at what we're doing right now, and we can also improve policy. And I would like to believe that we could have both of these discussions at the same time. In practice, I don't know what the answer is. But I do think it's a strong and probably unfounded claim to say that this is definitely going to starve off resources from this other conversation.
Right, sure.
Well, what makes this whole conversation so troubling is just that the criminal justice system's been used as a form of social control, right? So it would still be problematic if incarceration was evenly spread across the population. But now it's like, if 1 in 3 black men are going to touch the criminal justice system some point in your lives, and then you're subjecting that population to an algorithm that's 20% correct, it's not like the whole population has sort of an equal exposure to this sort of imperfect process. It's like very specific people who then have to face this very sort of inaccurate assessment, which is quite challenging.
But I guess, again, to push on this, I think we have to be careful between the algorithm and the policy.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say, oh, yeah, let's just throw out the algorithm and do something better. The problem is we don't know what's better right now. And we have policy. Yeah, we should stop incarcerating people for these things. But don't blame the algorithm.
Yeah, it's not the algorithm.
And I think I think that worry actually troubles me much more when people say, oh, it's the algorithm, let's look at all these bad algorithms. It's not the algorithm. The problem is we're not thinking seriously about criminal justice reform.
But risk assessment is not sort of a pure algorithm in some sense. It's a combination of policy and algorithm, right? When you build a risk assessment, there are a bunch of decisions that go into that are sort of policy adjacent, right? You make a decision to predict, say, failure to appear,
exactly.
or you make a decision to predict rearrest, or violent rearrest, or any of those things. These are all decisions that are made. You make a decision that you can include as one of your predictors, one of the things you're using to make that prediction, right? Charges that go back X years. Now, how many years can you go back? That has something to do with, it might be predictive to include charges that go back your entire life, but is that really fair? So maybe you'll make some cut and say, we're not going to count anything prior to 10 years ago. And then I think the most obvious way in which risk assessment isn't just sort of a, model for, it's not just some recommender system, right? Is that where the cutoffs fall. So you make some prediction that's some probability of this event that you've chosen to predict. Say you cut it at 20%, right? So if you have at least a 20% chance, according to this model, of having this bad outcome, then we're going to classify you as high risk. Now that 20% choice, that's a policy choice, right? You're putting you in the highest risk group, making it 20% and not 25%, or not 50% or 75%. That is a policy decision, and that is often sort of hidden in the guts of the algorithm, right? Now what comes out is some prediction, then layered on top of that prediction is sort of a bin or a classification where you're now high risk or low risk, but how we sort of cut up those predictions into those classifications is definitely not scientific. That is a policy decision, and what really worries me about risk assessment, if I'm going to be honest, is that once we've convinced everyone that this is a scientific process, now we're kind of stuck with it, but where those cut points fall can be moved, right? And we've seen this happen already. I think it happened in San Francisco, it's happened in Santa Cruz, and we saw it happen in a different type of risk assessment with ICE. I think that this was a relatively large news story maybe, I don't know, 6 months ago or something. ICE had a risk assessment tool they were using to recommend, to label some people as high risk of flight, some people as lower risk of flight. They actually moved the cut point, so where if your probability is below this point, you're considered high risk. They moved that probability all the way down to 0. So basically everybody was classified as high risk. Now that's still buried in the tool. This tool still sort of has the sheen of science and objectivity, and yet you can basically use that tool now to make this, that's absolutely just, now you have the policy that no one gets released, right? And now it's sort of hidden behind the tool. And so, again, I think it's dangerous to sort of to present risk assessment tools as purely scientific or purely an algorithm when there's all these decisions that
well, it's tough too because the human process is like, judges who haven't, or prosecutors who haven't brought a domestic violence case in their county for the last 25 years, like all of that's hidden too because we don't have that data. And so it's like humans who have made decision over and over and over and over and over again to basically have like a 0%, thing. It's like,
they may not even realize in the day-to-day they're making decisions in that kind of way. Right?
No, I think this is right. I think there's a lot of points of agreement here. I think the issue. So certainly, I think of algorithms as policy. They're encoding policy, and algorithms are not objective. They're doing exactly what you ask them to do. So if you ask them to, in algorithm, I even hate this word algorithm because what is it? This is like a checklist of saying we're going to put it's logistic regression. It's like third week. I'm literally going to teach it next week in my undergraduate statistics class. So the idea of algorithm being some fancy black box, I think that actually distorts discussion quite a bit. And really, we're just saying people who have similar criminal histories or other demographic characteristics like age, to you, what is the likelihood that they would recidivate if released, something like this. And the point is that these models tend to be able to estimate that one number much better than humans. This has been shown repeatedly in multiple domains. Now the question is, what do you do with that number? And what is that number? I mean, do you even care about recidivism? In many cases, no. It's like, how do you define recidivism? Is this violent crime? What does violent mean? If this is recidivism in terms of rearrest, this is almost certainly a bad idea because we know that conditional on committing the same crime, if you're a minority, you're much more likely to be arrested, particularly if this is for some low-level drug offense. Now, it's true that this is your likelihood of being rearrested. That's all this algorithm is telling you. And now all the policy is what you do with that number. Now, I would like to believe, and I think in this, it's not so crazy to believe that we can have this one number and also have sane policy. And but in reality, it's a lot to ask for. And so this is where the tension is coming. And so my whole world's premised on some sort of scientific rationality. And so it's hard for me to say that, you can't handle the information. That's just I'm sort of occupationally prohibited from saying that. But maybe that is the reality, that we can't, people actually can't handle that number. And if I tell somebody that this person has a 30% chance of being rearrested, they can't make the same decision with that information. I would like to believe that that's not true, but I wouldn't put the blame on the algorithm in that case. I would put the blame on the human. And I see the algorithm being thrown under the bus too often. And the problem with that is we're actually setting worse policy by saying, oh no, the human judge can handle it. Personally, I would much rather be evaluated by a risk assessment tool than a judge. And it's going to be, too much variance for me to handle.
I mean, in practice, what I've seen with risk assessment isn't showing you, though, or showing the judge the 30%. It's showing something like red, meaning stop, or high risk, or low risk, or green, or something like that. So it's actually not allowing judges to make that sort of trade-off, say, okay, 30% chance, say, of rearrest, and then do that calibration, say, but, we know this person's more likely to be arrested because of where they live, for example, so we should really downweight that. It's being communicated to them as a category. And I've even suggested in some cases, why don't you just show them the number? And I've had judge people tell me, well, we don't want to see a number. It's it's too complicated.
Yeah.
Wow.
This is why I don't like to be evaluated by a judge. No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, so certainly the message isn't current algorithms are good. I think that there's a lot to do behind presenting the information, on acting on the information, on deciding what that information even is. And this is something that we're actively working on. I do think we need to keep in mind what the status quo is, and not say that just because we're epsilon better than status quo, that's a great place to be. I don't think that's the answer, but that's certainly a constraint. And if we can move a little bit in the right direction with the hope of moving more in the right direction, I think that's something we have to explore.
Yeah, and one thing, I'm going to open for questions in a minute, but just my moderator privilege, one thing is, why are we using risk assessment to try and prevent harm rather than try and promote success? So if there was an algorithm that said, this person needs this kind of help, or this person, if you provide this kind of support pre-trial, then this person will show up at trial. So it's not high risk, it's high need. It's this person has resources, has strength, and needs to be supported in certain ways. I think that may be pie in the sky, but it might be able to flip.
No, these things exist. I mean, these risks and needs assessments. I mean, they're definitely in development. Again, these are things that we're working on, but they already are deployed in certain areas. So I think we are. This is part of this. I think it's easy to find blame in one piece of it, which distracts from the bigger questions. Like right now, I think a lot of energy is talking about are risk assessment tools good or bad. They're probably okay, is my guess. The real problem is everything else. And so it's surprising to me that we're spending so much energy talking about this one small piece of the criminal justice system, which almost certainly is a right move. At least this is my opinion, that it's a move in the right direction, but in a sense it doesn't matter. It's everything else around that which is important.
Yeah. So I'm going to open up now to questions in the audience. So.
Thanks so much. It's been really interesting. I guess one question that I had is sort of getting back to these sort of protective factors or success factors, and maybe also I was glad you say that ethnographic data is data. Is something like a framing and mark study for crime, right? A longitudinal study that allows us more than just these sort of snapshots release, don't release, and to sort of see what are these protective factors in people who grow up in, sort of unstable, unstable childhoods, and what are the sort of, I'd ultimately like to see some kind of cost-benefit analysis that, social welfare programs actually are the smartest thing you can do to be tough on crime. So, it's just preventive. So I was wondering, is Vera, or what are the, what's out there in terms of trying to do some longitudinal, sort of life course, studies on collecting data on, populations of people and seeing, are there things that are good interventions for people to, have some kind of success versus, again, just at the system level, saying like, all right, well, now this guy presents with all of these conditions, should we let him out or not?
Yeah. I mean, there have been some historically, some big longitudinal surveys that have been done. So Rob Sampson in Harvard and in Boston did some important work. There's a study in Rochester in New York, which followed people from an early age. And they have largely, I think, yielded the results that you might expect, that people who grow up in areas of concentrated disadvantage tend to have worse life outcomes. I think that drawing contemporary lessons from what we do in the justice system now, from those kind of studies, is difficult. I think we kind of know what a lot of the problems are. I think that there are incentives, the way the justice system operates, which frankly don't always care about those problems and act in certain ways. And so, how do we interrupt that behaviour? And also, there's been work. The federal government have funded work on justice reinvestment. Say, if we can change the justice system in ways that save money, we can reinvest that in social services. But those interventions haven't. I mean, they might be moving along the right lines, but in implementation, they haven't always been effective. So perhaps we just need to think about what went wrong with some of those things and lift them up. But I think, it's an important point. Yeah.
So I know we spent a lot of time on the algorithm question, but my question is the algorithm the problem, or the people coding the algorithm the problem, in terms of the biases people have with poverty and education levels or anything like that, and how these things can be embedded into the algorithm? And I think that was Dr. Jung's point at some point. And the second thing would actually be seeing that human beings are in these systems, human beings are in these jails and these prisons, is harm reduction is enough, is incremental change enough? When we have to think about while we're here at Stanford and living this life, seeing this environment, there are people that are behind jails, and it's sometimes we speak about it and we don't, are we forgetting that there are people suffering, people in inhumane conditions, and we bring it back to Brooklyn. Again, I'm from the Bronx, so it's a lot of different things. So it's we bring it to Brooklyn. It's people are in these spaces while we are here having this, civil conversation about it, but people are being harmed.
Yeah.
And again, I say that somebody with a parent that was incarcerated. It's is harm reduction enough? Is the trauma of these individuals once they come out, are we having the right discussion?
Yeah. I mean, I think that proximity is right. I mean, so a lot of these decisions are made in rooms that are very different from the rooms that, from jails, So I think that as I'm kind of giving the tools to the people who are mostly directly impacted and have the solutions, who are closest to the problems, is something that we don't do enough of. So and there needs to be more efforts to include voices of people, for example, who are incarcerated in these kind of conversations. But yeah, I think it's challenging that this discussion about technology and algorithms there's more than 2 million people behind bars in the criminal justice system today as we have this conversation, and that's easy to forget.
Yeah, I think this it's a great question. I think this work becomes really powerful when you combine it with movements, right? Like, and this panel was to talk about big data, but you know, another thing that we've done in our criminal justice work is fund movement leaders. So, you know, people like Patrisse Cullors, who co-founded Black Lives Matter and stopped one of the largest jails from being built in LA County, you know, not just using data, obviously, but you like put that in the hands of people who know how to organize, how to build social movements, how to put political pressure on decision makers. Like, that's where the magic happens, and it's really fun. You know, as a funder, you get to step back and take a look at the whole ecosystem and see how, you know, a grant to the Vera Institute generates like game-changing data that then gets into the hands of a really powerful, you know, movement leader like Patrisse Cullors, and she uses it to stop a jail from being built. Or like the Ella Baker Center in Oakland, same thing, right? I mean, you know, stopping youth facilities from, you know, being built in Alameda County, like using the data to be able to go in and talk to policymakers and move people to action is really where the magic happens.
I was actually really interested in your comment about the projects you have where you're incorporating people who are sort of most directly affected to interrogate the data themselves or be doing the data analysis themselves. I think that's really important, and I think actually, you know, this is something, and I'm going to regret saying this, so sorry. You know when you're about to...
You're on live stream.
That's all right. Well, Sherrod was saying...
Why are you looking at me?
I am looking at you because earlier you said, I mean, you said that, you know, I think there's some skill missing among the engineers when you're doing these sorts of things. We were talking about the sort of the particularities of the data. And, you know, I would suggest it's not so much a skill as a characteristic, and I think it's humility in a lot of cases, and it's sort of understanding and respecting the expertise of people who have the sort of lived experience or who have the sort of on-the-ground, real-life experience of these sorts of things. I've sort of seen this firsthand. There's this idea, this sort of, you know, tech solutionism, not to throw that word around, but, you know, that you can come in and make an app, and because you're an engineer, you don't need, you know, you're going to have the solution, right? And that there are these people who have the real world experience, and maybe they even have, you know, academic credentials. Maybe they're social scientists or something. But at the end of the day, I think even when you're listening to them, not you personally, I honestly don't mean you personally, but I think there's this. I honestly don't. I mean,
I feel like you might be talking about me.
I know. I just mean, sort of, you know, as someone who comes from the more tech side, I think when you're on the more tech side of things, I think you might be listening in the beginning, and then you sort of fall back into this.
What were you saying?
Idea
Sorry,
that,
I forgot.
This idea that you have the answer, right? That you don't really take in all of the information, all the expertise, and respect it to the extent that you should. So I love that you're but you know, working with people who have been affected to interrogate the data themselves. And I want to say thank you for your comment.
Yeah. There's a statistician who works as part of the CUNY system, and they have a course in collaborative statistics, which is exactly this, is how do you use statistics to empower people who are impacted by systems. So we need to use the microphones because people can't hear you on the live stream unless you're using a microphone. So the best way to do it, if you want to kind of line up by the microphones, might be the easiest.
Now I'm going to be super loud. Hi, thanks for being here. So I am a law student, and I came to law school to try to avoid math. And with an interest in this topic, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And so I'm actually curious, you've talked a lot about the kind of missing skills that engineers have, but obviously a lot of what you're doing does have policy implications. So what are the things that those of us on the policy and legal side should be doing to be able to translate as we're working with data, thinking about these and other issues?
So, I mean, just the first part of your comment, I think it is increasingly hard to operate in this field without some proficiency in statistics. And this, I think, is something that's going to change in the next, you know, maybe even the next few years. We're seeing here at Stanford Law School a lot more interest among the students with tackling these issues, even sitting in on you know, statistics classes. So I do think that's an important part of it, of this translation component of saying, here are the results. Now, how do I actually understand that, you know, this is how this algorithm is measured? What does that mean on the policy side? And I think going back to this point that Christian keeps on raising, and I agree with, is that the algorithm is embedding policy. And so what does that actually mean? It's like too easy to say, here's an algorithm and here's policy. But the reality is the policy is in the algorithm, and in a deep sense, the algorithm is the policy. If that's the only thing that you're presented with, then that's going to determine what you would do. So I think really making sure, I mean, we work with a lot of jurisdictions where they're like, give us the algorithm, and then we're going to figure out how to use it, and making sure that that's not how people are thinking. And saying, no, we want to be involved in every step of the way when you create this tool. And the point is, it's a tool to help them make decisions. It's nothing else. And if you cede that type of control, I think that's super problematic of saying, now you built this thing, and now let's figure out how to work around that. So I think that's like one way of when you're interacting with people who are developing these types of tools in the policy world, is make sure you're actually involved in every step of that process and help them design that.
Good evening. I might be maybe one of the few practitioners in the room as a probation officer. So I have a question. I noticed that the conversation tends to stem about, you know, what we can do on a larger scale and what we can do on a macro level. I'm wondering, how could we use big data on a micro level for the practitioners, for the probation officers, for the counselors, for the correctional officers, people that are actually doing the work with the people that are actually involved in the system? Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I think one of the problems for, probably not for probation officers so much, but for judges and people who work in courts, is people pass in front of them every day, and then they disappear, and they make a decision, and there's no feedback loop on how the decisions they make are impacting the people that they see. And so I think that one way of just is providing statistics on what happened to your clients. Did they succeed? How much time did they spend in jail? When they were released from jail, did they get the services they need? So just providing information so that people understand how well they're doing. In the same way that, I mean, teachers is probably not the best example because I know there's lots of problems with the way that teachers are rated. But most justice professionals have no information on their performance. And I think that's a real issue, I think. And I think learning where you succeed by seeing how the outcomes of people that you serve would be a good way of doing that.
The other thing I'll add is, I mean, we work with corrections departments, and I think there's a lot of use of data in identifying needs and determining which reentry programs are useful. And so this is often, it's just like, here are a bunch of programs, and there are all sorts of problems with it. Some of these are for-profit, they're not often monitored, and then what is a corrections officer actually supposed to do? It's like, okay, we did this in the past, but how do we actually know what's effective? And particularly for particular individuals. And even that's a hard statistical problem, one that we're working on. A simpler one is literally identifying who's getting out is actually like have these immediate needs. For example, they don't have a GED and they need one, or they don't have a place to stay that first like couple nights out. And it's just not collected in many places. So just creating this thing, or maybe it's collected at that last interview, the hour before you're released. And it's like, no, we're trying to push that so that it's at least collected a week before. So at least now there's some opportunity to do something at that reentry stage, because we know that those first few days are pretty problematic. And that's when a lot of people are losing touch, and it's a short window where you can operate. And that's where we're trying to intervene.
I think you both had really great ideas on that. I'm wondering if you asked that question because you had any ideas about how big data could be used?
Well, I don't know if everybody can hear me. You guys hear me? Yeah.
Would you, sorry, for the live stream, would you mind using the mic? Sorry about that. Thank you.
I mean, I know from experience that, the departments that I have worked for can be a little bit bureaucratic, and people are trying to do the best that they can to hold people accountable, to track data. And it's just kind of like, it's one of those, conundrums. It's like, what are you going to do? Are you going to hold people accountable? Okay, how come we're not holding people accountable? And there's so many forces at play that make that so challenging.
Yeah. And the way you hold people accountable can have different, like if you measure prosecutors on their case clearance, you're going to encourage them to clear cases quickly, and that can have all sorts of unexpected
right, and also collective bargaining and unions can have something to say about that as far as, discipline. So,
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great point.
Hi. Thanks all for being here. My question has to do with sort of the patchwork and hyper-localized nature of the criminal justice system, which, although we talk about it as the criminal justice system in this room, seems to me is sort of made up of lots of local courts, local police departments, and the like. and at the same time, big data has all to do with bigness, and from what little I know of data, it has to do with, is most effective when sort of everything is stored the same way and standardized. And I guess the question I have is, do you see the patchwork nature of criminal justice in America as an opportunity here because we can try out different things in different places, or a threat because we'll never be able to sort of get to the effectively use big data in the way we'd like, or something else, or sort of comment on those dynamics?
The easy answer is both. It's like, yeah, to give you a concrete example with risk assessment, the current standard is a national risk assessment tool, which is very loosely calibrated to local jurisdictions. Now, the problem is what you're going to do in New York is very different than what you're going to do in San Francisco. And this is a pretty serious problem. It's arguably one of the most serious problems in risk assessments. And so I think there is real value in creating local tools. Now, the problem is that often you just don't have the data. Maybe you can do this in San Francisco and other sort of large or moderately large cities. What are you going to do in the vast majority of the country where you just don't even have those type of data available to create your own custom models? So it's hard. The whole value of the bigness of the big data is that you have some kind of consistency and you can train these models, but at the same time, we do have to be cognizant of all the local patterns. It's not exactly clear how we're going to deal with that.
I'm going to channel my colleagues who are here in the audience from the In Our Backyards team. The challenge with having lots of jurisdictions, hey Jacob, hey Jasmine, is that it's fine if you're living in a city or a large county where you have resources, but the 2,500 small counties no one's looking at them, or historically hasn't looked at them, so we don't know what's going on there. And we've seen from the work that Vera's done that those places are where mass incarceration is booming over the last 10 years, and also applying kind of technologically complex solutions in those places, they just don't have the ability to do that. So I think there's some challenges there.
Hi, thank you all. So there's a lot of discussion in the machine learning and statistics community about what it means for an algorithm or an algorithmic decision process to be quote-unquote fair, particularly in domains as complex and fraught as the criminal justice system. And I know, Sharad, you've done work explicitly on this, but I'd be interested to hear from the panelists what they think it means or what criterion they might use to measure whether or not an algorithm is quote-unquote fair, or, for example, racially unbiased, particularly in making sure that it's not encoding historical injustices.
I honestly, again, sorry, this is live stream. I don't think it means anything. I think people throw this word around, fairness, and it lacks meaning. And so certainly there's not going to be a checklist that says you do this, this, and this. All of a sudden we're going to certify your algorithm as fair. That I think doesn't exist, and it's not going to exist. And I think the problem is that the policy is in the algorithm. And so what does it mean for a policy to be fair? If we had, is this law fair? I don't think we're going to be like, oh yeah, well, let's just run this check on it. We would never ask that question about a policy. But that's how we have to start thinking about an algorithm. And I think this is, again, the blind spot of the engineer is we just want to run some unit test on this algorithm and say, okay, spit it out, green, good to go. And I think that's fundamentally the wrong way to think about these types of algorithms. I mean, the closest that I can think of for fairness is that it's doing its very specific job the best that we know how. And so, for example, if it's a risk assessment, that's actually estimating risk most accurately as possible. Now, the problem is what you do with it is where all the difficulty comes in. And so if you take that prediction of whether or not someone is going to be arrested for a drug crime, and then you say, let's lock up everybody who has a high probability of being arrested for a drug crime, that's almost certainly a bad thing to do. Now, the algorithm is fair in the sense that it estimated that thing very accurately, but everything else about that policy was presumably unfair. So I think this is the exact question that people ask. I very much would like people to stop asking that question. And not to put you on the spot, I mean, I think with that, like people, always ask me whenever I go to any of these places, they're like, okay, just give us a checklist. It's like, and I'll be like, well, I have it in my back pocket, and like, here's a checklist. It's like, no, it's like, that doesn't exist. We have to stop thinking about that. There are certain mistakes that come up over and over again, and we shouldn't make those mistakes, but short of that, I don't think there is some sort of universal definition, and we just need a few years and we'll figure it out. So I hope that we can shift this conversation to something else, even though this is the question that keeps on coming up.
But sorry.
Go ahead, please.
I mean, isn't part of the fairness discussion, though, when it comes to this particularly narrow application of risk assessment, say, does it make the same recommendations based on things like gender and age and race? And so, and how do you judge whether that decision is the same for different groups? Because there's different measures of what the same means, right? Is it as equally predictive for different groups? Does it recommend detention at the same rate for different groups? Is it the right number of false positives? I mean, there's a variety of criteria you could apply to that question, which would answer whether it's fair or not. Right?
So I don't think it would answer whether it's fair or not. You can ask those questions.
Right.
And what I am encouraging people to do is not to interpret those questions as questions of fairness.
Right.
And so the algorithm is not recommending to detain someone or not. It's never doing that. The human is doing that. The algorithm at a very core level is estimating the likelihood of some event. That's all it's doing. Everything that you want to put around that is the human policy. And so keeping these two things separate, I think, is important. Even just to sort of elaborate on this example, a lot of people think it's unfair to have algorithms that consider gender when making a decision, or using race when making these estimates. So in many parts of the criminal justice system, among men and women who have similar criminal histories, men are more likely to reoffend. And so an algorithm that doesn't consider gender is more likely to suggest that women are higher risk than they actually are. Now, some people consider that's the fair thing to do. We're just not going to consider gender. But I would say this is at least problematic. It's a more complicated question than just saying it's not using gender, so therefore it's fair.
I guess I just want to reiterate something I said earlier about, and I think you agree with me here, but the policy part of the algorithm, again, isn't just the thing that's wrapped on top of after you have the predicted probabilities, right? Like the predicted probabilities are conditional on what you put into the model, and you can make all sorts of decisions about what is allowed to go into the model, just like you said about gender, and also about what the thing is that you're predicting at all. So it's not even just that last step. It's not even just like what's on top of the prediction. It's like what the prediction is itself is, or how the prediction is built is all sort of wrapped up in policy. And so, I mean, I'll answer your question more directly. I think I actually do think it is useful to be, talking about the different definitions of fairness. I think what you were getting at was sort of, I'm guessing, probably some of the debate about whether, disparate false positive rates versus disparate predictive accuracy, all those sorts of things are more are the right definition of fairness when we're talking about risk assessment. Is that roughly what you were asking?
Yeah.
And you are sort of putting us on the spot because that is, there's certainly a hot debate about which is the right definition, and as we know, they're mutually incompatible when we have different baseline rates of, say, rearrest, if that's what we're predicting. And so, I think it's going to be highly contextually specific. I think you have to think very carefully at how the data was created. So in places where if you think there is substantial police bias in terms of who's getting rearrested, I think most of the definitions where we're looking at false positive rates don't make any sense, right? Because you're predicting something that is itself a biased measure of what you want to be predicting, right? Criminality. So most of the definitions, I think, really fall apart when we're operating in a system where the data was collected by especially biased policing. In that case, I think, just to answer your question directly, I think demographic parity is probably the right answer in those cases. That's not a popular answer, but that is what I think. I think in other cases we could consider some of the other ones if we could be very certain that policing was fairly applied.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, I disagree. But I think this is. I think that's exactly. Not to put Cristiano on the spot. I think this is the problem with the debate that we're having is that there are. Let's say 4 or 5 or 22, how many ever definitions that people come up with these things every day. I think it's not actually appropriate to measure these algorithms by those metrics. I think they almost universally miss the point. And it makes it easy to take the policy or the algorithm outside of the specific context by saying, okay, it satisfies demographic parity, it satisfies equal false positive rates, any of these things. I think they give us a very misleading picture of what the consequences are of rolling out this algorithm. And that's how we think about the fairness. To the extent that we think about the fairness of actual policy, that's how we think about it. We say, what are the consequences of this thing that we're going to do? Let's say we're going to roll out some law. What are the consequences of that? What are the consequences on certain groups? What are all of these other things that are tangled up on that? And what all these types of measures are capturing is something completely distinct. And they're not actually asking about consequences. They're these very funny statistical metrics that I think often are just not, they're being misapplied. So I would caution pretty strongly against using these quantitative measures when estimating the fairness.
I mean, to be provocative, is what's the saying? Guns don't kill people, people kill people. You know, isn't that so? They can be, if misused, they can be dangerous. And I think to say that we just need to not think about the algorithms and like look at the policies, I'm not entirely.
No, if you think about these quantitative measures that have been
So
proposed.
I certainly don't think that it, like you were saying, that should be a checklist, that we pick one and that's the end. I think they need a lot more scrutiny along a lot of the dimensions that you've discussed. So I didn't mean to imply that was sort of, that, for example, in that case you'd say demographic parity and let's be done with it. I don't mean that, but I was just saying I think, you know, just to sort of more directly answer the question, that in those circumstances I do think that would be the more appropriate. If I had to pick, that's sort
But
of
I think the
direction
problem
would
is
go.
it's a false choice. You don't have to choose one.
But I think it is something worth evaluating. I think when we're looking at the algorithms, and again, I feel some discomfort about calling them the algorithms and the AI or whatever, but I do think it is a useful thing to look at.
So I think we probably have time for 2 more questions, if they're quick.
Thank you again for this interesting conversation. When I heard the phrase risk assessment, I was regularly thinking bail reform in California, which, as I understand it, if it ever gets moving forward, when the bondsman industry stops objecting. Anyway, that it's all about what's going to happen in courtrooms. And the concept that I think didn't come up is, what will this do to the usefulness of judges? Or, I mean, it's all about, one version of it, it's all about judges covering their proverbials by either having huge bails or going to a risk assessment. Where does the judicial activity fit into what you're thinking and suggesting?
So for the most part, I think risk assessments have been used mostly as just a recommendation to judges. So to help them sort of calibrate the risk a particular person presents of a certain outcome. And so ultimately, at least in most cases I've seen, they still do have sort of the ultimate, you know, authority and the leeway to make the decisions that they'd like. You know, I have seen.
But would a judge dare go against the recommendation?
They do all the time. In fact, they do all the time. Yeah. You know, I only have one example I can think of where a risk assessment is used to sort of draw a hard line in the sand to sort of classify people as being eligible or not for certain programs. I've only seen that one time. In every other case, it's always just sort of a recommendation, and they only seem to be very loosely followed.
But I think this is actually a really good point. So SB 10, to get into the minutia of SB 10, this is this bill, California bail reform, that's happening. One of the dangers is that there is this risk classification, and if it says high risk, then all of a sudden you can't override it. And this is highly problematic, and it depends exactly where you set the threshold. So there's this conversation going on where do you set that threshold. But even if it were not mandated by law that this is how it would operate, I think there is a real concern that if you were to show a judge, this person is high risk, how often are they going to feel comfortable releasing that person? And so it is in theory a recommendation, and I think it has to be a recommendation. At the same time, we're definitely pushing people to thinking in a certain way. I think to the extent that they're going against these risk assessments, they often just don't see them. And so if they're, you know, they're buried in the bail report or whatever, but if they actually were presented like this person is high risk, you know, big red, what are you going to do? I think it's hard. And so it's tricky, and we have to present that information in a way where sometimes we are allowed to override. I think that's the right thing to do, but also make it so that judges aren't just doing whatever they want to do, because the whole point of risk assessment is to bring some more consistency to that process.
Okay, we're nearly at time. Hema, Joe.
Oh, great. Thank you. A comment, very quick comment and a question. On the comment, Justin, I think it was you who was responding to a question around, you know, the sort of the human quality of all of this. And you mentioned, you know, that the real magic happens when the data ends up in, you know, the hands of people who can lead social movements and the like. And what I would comment on is that I think the real magic also happens in, you know, large bureaucratic systems where people choose to work in a county, you know, in a county supervisor's office or elsewhere, and, you know, not maybe going just in academia or just going in the nonprofit sector. And so, you know, having practitioners in the room is great, but I would urge people who are social justice minded to choose careers that really create that kind of magic, and that magic through osmosis is really, it's infectious when others who are in the positions to make very important decisions are around that. And then along those lines, the question is, you know, Christian, you had mentioned, you gave this example at the outset that you had received data from a sheriff's department where it was all in PDF form. And I wondered, you know, what efforts have you or others pursued around legislative fixes to get data to be, the collection of data to be, you know, with greater fidelity, and you have consistency across these large systems. To give you an example, in California, we changed the law some years ago such that all school districts have to produce data around teacher salaries and collect it in a certain way. And so it's not always enforceable, but the law exists. And so I'm wondering, have there been any pursuits around changes in legislative fixes around data collection?
Honestly, I don't know. I'm not really involved in legislation so much. Does anyone else? Do you know?
Data collection in California? I mean, so there's
or
this,
like the sheriff example, or
I mean, so there's this the REPA stuff that's happening. So we're going to have uniform data collection across all law enforcement agencies in California. So this is one sort of example. But I think there's algorithmic accountability in New York. So there's some versions of this happening, but I think it's still pretty early.
yeah. I mean, measures for justice, right? You mentioned them.
Florida.
That's certainly not legislative, but part of what they're doing is trying to get, you know,
Florida is
more
doing
consistent
this.
data.
Yeah, they worked with the Republicans in Florida to pass a bill that would mandate criminal justice data reporting
Right.
and essentially feed into their system. So,
Yeah.
and I think there's more states. I mean, they've approached us about other states in the South that are following Florida's example, which is exciting.
Thank you.
We're at time. So,
one point no one's made, just wanted to raise, is that a lot of the risk assessment instruments are for-profit, proprietary, and as a litigator, they won't reveal anything about the risk assessment instrument.
Yep.
And it's also true of a lot of validated instruments that are used in criminal justice, for parole, for sex offenders. You have, quote, validated instruments, and then when you go to ask to see the underlying information, it's a trade secret, it's proprietary, and the governmental entity has signed a contract saying that they will not release the information. So I would argue that the fairness question, nothing should be used in the criminal justice system unless it's accessible. That's a fundamental fairness, and that you as scholars and people who are in this field should not validate or publish things where the underlying data and information is not available to be assessed by the public, by courts, by people in the system. Because when you actually get in there, and we have to take depositions of scientists, it's not comfortable, they don't like that. And when you actually ask them, well, where did this assumption come from? It wasn't necessarily from a study or from something. I interviewed 5 correctional officers, and they said, you know, people with mental illness tend to be the ones who have bad behavior. So that's why we gave them extra points. And that's not revealed in the published study. It's not revealed in the validation. It's not revealed anywhere in the instrument. And so, you know, those kind of biases are built in. I think they're always going to be built in. That's okay, but they have to be revealed. And I think that it's very hard to get to underneath now.
I think that's an important point. And I also think it goes beyond what you said, because it's not just the proprietary tools, right? Arguably the most popular or widespread risk assessment right now is the tool, the PSA made by the Arnold Foundation, which isn't a for-profit. I think they did just restructure to become an LLC like a week ago or something.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, so I'm slightly outdated, but at least when that was released, it was a foundation, right? And even that, I think that tool has really been let off the hook quite a bit in terms of transparency, I think. Yeah, so it certainly
conscious
goes
of the
beyond
time,
proprietary
we're
models.
just to wrap up, so we could continue for much longer, I think, but I want to let people get out of here. So if I didn't say I'd do this, I'm putting you on the spot. What's your is there one takeaway that you each would kind of take away from this? Something that stuck out to you.
Stuck out to me. Lots of problems, lots of solutions.
So you've got to be less than 10 words now.
Okay. Haiku form?
Haiku problem. Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to let you off because I've just sprung this on all of you, and it's an unfair question. But I would say that something, again, drawing from one of my colleagues who works with this same project, looks at jails, is technology can help us solve some solutions, but does it deliver a world that we want to live in? So you know, yes, it can. If we set the standards by which we're judging different solutions by, we can satisfy those standards. But are those actually the ways that we want to be going? And I think that's an important philosophical question as we think about how we use technology.
Yeah, and even broadly, I would say that data and all of these issues that we've been talking about are a bit of a red herring, and that I think it's important not to say that this is going to be the fix.
Yeah.
So it's like, this is what really, again, strikes me about this risk assessment discussion, is that it seems sort of marginal in this entire criminal justice system that is messed up in every way you can imagine. And now we are focusing on this one thing that, you know, maybe is doing something relatively good in this entire system. It's like, but I think it's attractive to talk about it because it involves data, involves algorithms, it sounds cool. Really all the problems that we need to solve are boring and no one actually wants to think about them because they're painful to think about. Yeah. And this goes back to, you know, Christian's opening example, that it's like, real people are suffering in ways that are not captured in all of these efforts that I fully support to catalog data and to do cool things with them. But it's just a much messier, much more uncomfortable problem than it appears to be when you talk about data and technology.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point to end on. So I'd just like to thank the panelists for this discussion and for everyone staying with us.
That was great.
Yeah, interesting conversation.
That was a good conversation.
Thank you.
I was surprised by your answer about the fairness stuff, given